I don't know how many of you were here for the talk I gave last year, but I finished it off with my intuition that any post-human state worthy of the name is going to run into a fair bit of resistance from our own brain stems. I made the point that our imperative for self-preservation hinges really on how the gut defines the self. And my guess was that the gut, being a powerful but profoundly stupid master, wouldn't really be able to tell the difference between transcendence and death. And in fact, maybe there is no true difference. Changing yourself into something completely different, stripping away all your mammalian instincts and cognitive glitches, replacing them with something smarter and more farsighted and just all around better, that basically means overwriting what you are with something else. So I wondered if our own sense of "Dad burn it, Mirtha, that just ain't natural" might put some serious brakes on this whole post-human thing. Now, I did cite an exception in which people might embrace a truly alternative existence, generally when the current state of one's existence was so miserable that ending it would be a step up. The suicidal, the social outcasts, reviled, guilt-ridden child abusers, for example. And given that any new world-changing technology is bound to be expensive at first, I suggested that the organization most motivated to prototype the singularity would have to be obscenely wealthy and populated by a lot of unhappy deviants who'd already been primed to believe in a better and different afterlife. I suggested that the Catholic Church might fit these criteria more closely than anything out of Silicon Valley. Any of you who saw that talk on YouTube will have missed that punchline, since the recording cut out just before I got to that point. Apparently the memory card on the camera filled up. There's another route to the post-human scenario, though. And that gets around the gut because the gut never sees it coming. And that's the road I want to head down to today. You can think of gut feelings as an executive summary, the end point of some subconscious algorithm that's too big to fit into the conscious mind, so you just get the final answer without seeing any of the work. But the gut feeling itself, by definition, has to be consciously experienced, even if the processes leading to it remain opaque. Some conscious self-aware entity has to be looking at that executive summary in order to go, ew. You may know that I'm not entirely sold on the evolutionary value of this whole consciousness thing, but one thing I will admit is that you do need self-awareness for aesthetics. A sheer evolutionary computation can shape you to avoid touching a maggot-riddled corpse, for example, or to gravitate towards a healthy green environment with a high fractal dimension. But you cannot find the corpse subjectively revolting or the habitat beautiful without being conscious. And all iterations of consciousness we've encountered, so far at least, seem to run on some kind of nervous system. So the question I'm going to lead off with is, what do you need to run that program? What is the minimum level of complexity required for a sense of aesthetics, for a nervous system to wake up? Is a single neuron awake? Can an individual neuron enjoy Jethro Tull, for example? After all, these are the things that fire when we hear music or watch porn or experience any sensation at all. So we know a single neuron reacts to music. But does it experience music by itself? Probably not. You probably need a bunch of neurons working together to do that. But how many? Where do you draw the line? This is the complete nervous system of a leech, stripped out of its body and hooked up to an oscilloscope. What we have here is a system that evolved to behave in response to environmental inputs. Now, there are no environmental inputs here. The system's been cut off from its sense organs, so it's got nothing to respond to. And yet it behaves anyway. These spikes represent motor commands to swim or to crawl. According to the guys who ran the experiment, the nervous system is making specific locomotory decisions in the absence of any of the inputs that usually inform such choices. So what is this disembodied system basing its decisions on? What is it experiencing? Is it misinterpreting random static from cauterized input cables, just parsing noise the best way it knows how? Is the system running on old recycled data, internal data that it mistakes for outside input? Is it dreaming, in other words? Some folks cite this behavior as evidence for something they call free will. Maybe we don't need a nervous system, at least not one made out of meat. For a number of years now, IBM and the US Department of Defense have been working on something called systems of neuromorphic adaptic plastic scalable electronics. I'm guessing a good chunk of that time was spent pushing Scrabble tiles around trying to come up with a project name that spelled Synapse when you turned it into an acronym. Anyway, Synapse is basically a quest to build a hardware emulation of an organic brain, right down to the synaptic level. Back in 2007, they reported completion of a software model half as complex as a mouse brain that could run at maybe 1/10 real-time speed. And just 2 years later, they'd gotten as far as a cat cortex, 1 billion neurons, 10 trillion synapses. The hardware department is still playing catch-up. They're planning on reaching the mouse stage within the year. And their goal is real-time human brain emulation by 2019. And by definition, any good model behaves in a way similar to the original. So the question is this thing going to wake up in 2019 when they build it? Now, speaking of cat cortexes, you've got one down in your gut. At least there is a neural net lining your gastrointestinal tract that has the computational complexity of a cat brain. Now, anyone familiar with cats will recognize the irony here, insofar as cats are pretty much just stomachs with fur anyway. I called this one the tum that tells time back when he was still with us. But cats are also pretty smart. I mean, they may not be great philosophical thinkers, but I think you'd have an uphill battle arguing that they're devoid of conscious intent or awareness. Which raises the question of whether that neural net in your gut, synaptically comparable to banana here, might not be conscious in its own way, sitting down there in the dark, experiencing its own gastrointestinal dreams and ambitions, maybe plotting some rebellion against the elitist 1%er up in the skull. Who knows? I keep doing that. I keep asking you questions, and then I keep sort of answering them with a shrug and a who knows. So this is probably a good time to admit that one of the big problems with deciding whether or not something's conscious is that we don't have a clue what consciousness even is, or how it works. Computation's one thing. That's just sensory input and motor commands with logic gates in between. You can see how natural selection would promote intelligence and problem solving. But that doesn't require consciousness. And it certainly doesn't explain how consciousness manifests. You wire meat up in a million different ways, and it's just fizzy meat. But you change the wiring just so, and it wakes up. How the hell does that happen? You can watch ions hopping across synapses. You can follow nerve impulses from nose to toes. There's absolutely nothing in any of those physical processes that would lead you to expect the emergence of subjective awareness. It's current running through meat. That's all it is. It's computation. Why does computation wake up? And why only certain kinds? Why does the cerebrum wake up when it's running, but not the cerebellum? Is it just the pattern of energy flow that matters? Will any simulation wake up just so long as it reproduces the flow of information through the brain closely enough? Does this mean you could create a very slow but real kind of consciousness out of habit trail tubes and ping pong balls, just so long as the arrangement of the tubes and balls mimic the arrangement of our dendrites and potassium ions? Is consciousness basically some basic property of all matter, like charge or mass? Does every rock and pebble have some kind of rudimentary sense of self we just don't know how to detect? This panpsychic bullshit sounds like the worst kind of New Age woo, but apparently it's a real theory with real math backing it up. I have the papers on my hard drive. I admit I haven't gotten around to reading them yet. Now, there are certain correlates of consciousness, neural signatures that always seem to accompany the conscious state in beings that we know are self-aware. In humans, at least, consciousness results when a bunch of subcortical structures, the brainstem, the thalamus and hypothalamus, the anterior cingulate cortex, all start talking to the frontal lobes. But integration is key here. Neurons in all these parts have to be firing in sync with each other. There's a tightly coordinated call and response interaction here that seems essential to the waking state. We're talking milliseconds here. There's a guy called Giulio Tononi out of the Neurosciences Institute in San Diego. He's derived a metric of neural integration which he claims not only detects consciousness, but actually quantifies it, puts a hard number to the degree of awareness that accrues to everything from roundworms to humans, including the level of awareness being experienced by the grandmother your doctor claim has been in a vegetative coma for the past 6 months. So as you can imagine, this guy's in a fairly high demand at palliative care centers around the country. Now, given these data, we can take a stab at answering some of the hypotheticals I rattled off earlier. Planet-sized brain made out of habit trail tubes and ping-pong balls would probably not be self-aware, because ping-pong balls just can't move across a 1,000-kilometer brain pan fast enough to keep all the parts in sync. Now, this is not to say that such an arrangement couldn't still be intelligent in the computational sense. It just wouldn't be awake. On the other hand, if Tononi's right, a computer would become self-aware if it were programmed to integrate information in the same way that our brains do. And the jury is still out over whether your gastrointestinal tract is conscious. But these are just numbers and correlations. They still don't answer the fundamental question of why some meat is sentient and why some isn't, how chemicals and electricity can just wake up like this. Nobody knows that. Which didn't stop a bunch of neuroscientists from releasing something called the Cambridge Declaration at the Francis Crick Memorial Conference on Consciousness just last July. The signatories of this declaration are a fairly prestigious and credible lot in their own right. Much was made of the fact that their declaration was signed, quote, in the presence of Stephen Hawking, unquote. Don't quite know what this means, because Hawking is not listed as a signatory himself. So it's possible, I suppose, given his mobility issues, they just set up a card table beside him and then signed their declaration really fast before he could roll away. But basically, they all came clean and admitted that a variety of other species were self-aware. I'm not sure how seriously I take this declaration. I find its conclusions completely plausible. I've always thought that people vastly underestimate the cognitive complexity of other creatures. But it's not as if these guys were announcing the results of some groundbreaking new experiment that settled the issue once and for all. As far as I can tell, they just sat down over beers and took a show of hands over whether we should let bonobos into the club. Still, they are experts in the field and more qualified than I am to pass these kinds of judgments. And one of their more interesting claims is that, notwithstanding all that thalamocortical activity I was talking about, consciousness is not dependent on arbitrary specific brain structures. The declaration grants near-human levels of consciousness to parrots, who do not have neocortexes, and to octopi, whose brains don't have any anatomical resemblance to ours at all. Basically, an octopus brain is just a bagel made out of neurons wrapped around the esophagus. It's the neurological complexity of the structure that's essential to the conscious state, they seem to be saying. The motherboard can take any shape, so long as it's got enough synapses on board. The issue of whether something is conscious becomes a lot easier when the thing in question can actually tell you for itself. We can debate about neural nets in the gut or vivisected leech nervous systems, but we pretty much know for a fact that when it comes to human beings, it doesn't take a whole brain to be self-aware. Half a brain does just fine. You've all probably heard about alien hand syndrome. Dr. Strangelove is probably the most famous cinematic example, but there are loads of real-life cases in which people seem to go to war with their own limbs. You try to put on a certain shirt, your evil hand tries to take it off and get another one. You want to write something down on a notepad, your evil hand tries to snatch the pen away and write something else. Now, such cases generally arose following split brain experiments in which the nerve bundle between the hemispheres, the corpus callosum, gets cut down the middle. Now, this used to be a pretty common procedure in cases of epilepsy. Worked by cutting the feedback loop between the hemispheres that allowed electrical storms to build up in the brain. And what happened afterwards was, when these two hemispheres were cut off from each other, they basically went their own separate ways. They developed their own personalities with their own interests, even their own religious beliefs. A famous neurologist by the name of Ramachandran, most of you have probably heard of this guy. If you haven't, I would really recommend his books. He reports a case of split brain in which one hemisphere was an atheist and one was a believer. And Ramachandran reports being puzzled as to why that didn't rock the religious community to its core, since it raises the question of whether, one hemisphere goes to heaven while the other one goes to hell, who gets the eyes, all of these things. Anyhow, because the speech centers generally reside in the left hemisphere, only that hemisphere gets to talk. So when the right hemisphere doesn't like what the left one is doing, it can't talk. It can only act by using the half of its body under control. Now, it's important to note that the hemispheres are not completely isolated. They can still talk the long way by sending signals via the brainstem, but it's a longer route and a much thinner pipe. Think of it as dial-up as opposed to broadband. The key words here are latency and bandwidth. Signals pass back and forth along this route fast enough for the whole system to act as an integrated whole, to think of itself as I. But when you force those signals to take the scenic route, and worse, squeeze them through a straw, these two halves fall out of sync. They lose their coherence. I shatters into we. Now, you might think that an established personality split down the middle might take some time to develop distinctly separate personalities. Not so. Ramachandran also describes a case in which one hemisphere of a patient's brain was anesthetized prior to surgery, but the other was left awake. And that undrugged hemisphere, unshackled from the anesthetized one, suddenly manifested a completely different personality. The normal whole brain patient was a shy introvert, but whittled down to one hemisphere, he started cracking jokes and coming on to the nurses. Now, that personality resubmerged when the other half woke up. The original psyche reasserted itself. So it seems that the consciousness program, whatever it is, runs on whatever circuits are available to it. If it's only running on one core, it'll reflect the wiring in that core. But when it's running on two, there's no evidence that each side contains its own little sub-personality thinking, hey, I'm part of something bigger. The local personae are obliterated. They're absorbed into a single integrated consciousness filling the available space. Remember that. It leads to some pretty scary implications for anybody who uses iTunes. So, we know that partial, standalone chunks of brain can be self-aware. I trust I don't have to convince you that intact human brains are also self-aware. So now we can move past all this groundwork and start poking out beyond the confines of baseline humanity. You may have seen these two on TV or read about them in any number of magazine articles. The Hogan twins, from Vernon, BC, fused at the head. Now, craniopagus twins are extremely rare in any case, but these two appear to be unique in that they are not just fused at the skull or the vascular system. They are fused at the brain, more specifically at the thalamus, which, among other things, acts as a sensory relay. So Krista and Tatiana Hogan share a common set of sensory inputs. Tickle one, the other laughs. Each can see through the other's eyes. There is anecdotal evidence that they even share thoughts. And although they do have distinct personalities, they use the word I when describing the other twin. So, two identities, one sensorium, because they're fused at a sensory relay. What if they were fused at the prefrontal cortex instead? If two hemispheres can each run separate, standalone programs yet form a single coherent entity when fused, what about the fusion of two complete brains, a single contiguous porridge of neurons spread across two heads? Does a thought know to stop at the edge of one skull without traveling into the other? Would we still be talking about two individuals, or one computational entity with twice the mass of a human brain? Given a different roll of the dice, we could be talking about the ultimate Marvel supervillain here. Now, the Hogan twins appear to have avoided that plight, even though they share senses and maybe even thoughts, and I suspect they maintain separate identities thanks to the same long-distance, low-bandwidth connection that maintains separate personalities in split-brain people. Once again, latency and bandwidth are the things to keep in mind, because now we are starting to think outside the skull. Mirror neurons think outside the skull by definition. They're a kind of monkey see, monkey do circuit. They fire both when you do something and when you see somebody else doing the same thing. I drink a beer, certain mirrors fire. I watch you drink a beer, the same neurons fire, even though I'm not moving. It's been suggested that mirror neurons are essential to developing a theory of mind, to empathy, to consciousness itself. Ramachandran's all over them in that context. But sometimes mirror neurons go bad. Normally, they just fire quietly to themselves when they see someone else doing something. In victims of echopraxia, however, those signals run right down the motor nerve to the muscles, and they force the body to follow suit. Echopraxiacs are compelled to mimic actions they see other people performing. Now, interesting implications follow from this. If you want to kill someone suffering from echopraxia, lure him onto the roof of a skyscraper and get him to stand 10 meters from the edge. You stand 20 meters back, then run forward 15 meters. What you have done, beyond turning your victim into street pizza, is send an instruction set along an optical channel. He receives it through his eyes, but it might as well be fiber optic for all the difference it makes. He processes that packet and it executes it. If another echopraxiac happens to be standing nearby, the very act of executing the instruction set also serves to pass it on. What you've done, in other words, is turned the poor bastard into a node in a wireless network. Now hang on, you're saying. Echopraxia is very cool and all. But how is this any different from what any of us do when we read the instructions on how to fill out our tax forms, or submit to an anal probe at the hands of your friendly neighborhood border guard? You're receiving external commands then, too. And you have about as much choice in the matter as echopraxia would give you, but nobody tarts up those kind of routine activities with computer network jargon. The difference is that it takes a lot more time to read and process written instructions for the guy with the truncheon to describe how he wants you to drop your pants and bend over, especially since he adds the word sir to every sentence. Echopraxia's packet transmits at light speed. The bottleneck step is the rate at which your motor nerves fire. So, echopraxia is proof of principle that we can not only become nodes in a network, but that such a meat-containing network might be fast enough to start doing things on its own, independent of the wishes of the meat itself. Now, this is a map of the internet. It's the obvious, ubiquitous network that we are all in the process of merging with. The whole idea of the internet waking up is something of a cliche in skiffy circles. And the closely related idea of humanity merging with a computer system to become a hive mind has been kicking around at least since Isaac Asimov wrote The Last Question back in the 50s. On a superficial level, you can see the parallels between a brain and the internet. They're both distributed networks. They're both massively redundant. The way in which we lay down links between sites looks a little like the way repeated experience lays down and strengthens neural pathways in an organic brain. And that arrow goes in both directions. Just as we shape the internet's neural pathways, it reshapes ours. I'm not just talking about the internet here. Of course, smartphones, daytimers, that whole menagerie that connects us one to another. They're all attached to the internet more often than not. So we might as well consider the whole menagerie as part of the same network. Call it the Ubersphere. If biosphere means the sum total of life on the planet and noosphere means the sum total of human thought, then we might as well hang Ubersphere on the sum total of human thought plus the various networks that connect to it. Now, I don't know who first coined the term exocranium. I first encountered it in Charlie Strauss's Accelerando, which comes as close as I've yet seen to conveying some gut sense of what it might be like to outsource your cognition. Accelerando's protagonist goes through the first part of his story wearing a set of high-tech specs, basically Google Glass, which was not bad for like 1991, that envelop him in a virtual cloud of automated daytimers and GPS apps and stock market analysis. One day he loses those specs, and he is effectively lobotomized. He has become so dependent on computational add-ons that when forced to fall back on his own meat, he literally has a hard time remembering his own name. It would help if I could remember where I keep the rest of my mind, he complains. We now have empirical evidence that Charlie was spot on about this, thanks to a woman called Betsy Sparrow at Columbia University. She's recently reported in Science magazine that cognitive outsourcing has reached the point where the qualitative nature of memory itself is changing. We are increasingly unable to remember things for ourselves, but we are becoming increasingly adept at remembering how to find out the things we've forgotten. The official term for this is transactive memory system. But what it comes down to is that we are already part of a sort of group mind, mediated through electronic networks. The parts of our brains once used to store information locally now store search protocols for accessing a distributed database remotely. And that's great. That's adaptive, just so long as we remain in contact with the group mind. But unplug us from the exocranium, and increasingly, we become drooling idiots. I think there's also been some related research explicitly showing that the physical macrostructures of our brain are also changing, but I do not have internet access right now, so I can't remember the details. Now, certain folks have fallen in love with the thought of the ubersphere as a single vast brain with our puny human brains playing the role of individual neurons within it. They seem to regard it as a radical concept, but it's actually quite comforting if you remember that instinctive resistance to the singularity I mentioned back at the top of the talk, that gut-level transformation equals suicide perspective. After all, an iguana neuron is pretty much indistinguishable from a human neuron. The fact that one may be firing in service of solving a differential equation while the other is helping track a fly across the visual field makes no difference at all to the individual neuron. So if we become neurons in a greater brain, we can have our cake and eat it too. We retain our individual identities while at the same time participating in the next grand phase of the post-human experience. What would that ubermind be doing? Way up at the next order of emergent complexity? Who knows? A lone neuron can't even conceive of the concept of music, much less understand that it's rocking out to 9 Inch Nails. But we did build the damn thing. It didn't evolve the way we did, so it's unlikely to have the same kind of instincts and imperatives that drive us. Any instincts it does have will be ones that we put there, deliberately or otherwise. So, given the lack of its own agenda, I'm guessing it will continue to act on ours. And in that light, I'd like to dispense with the hokey "we are neurons in a great brain" analogy and replace it with this. Maybe we're more like the tube feet in this starfish. Starfish have no central brain. Each individual tube foot behaves more or less independently, sniffing out food and reacting to its environment at a purely local level. They don't all pull the same way, in other words. The whole starfish travels in the direction of the net vector. It's kind of a single organism democracy. So in vague operational terms, maybe we're headed for something like that. Either way, is this just a cute science fiction-y metaphor? Or does an electronically networked population of human minds really integrate into some kind of vast entity capable of doing things that its individual components can't possibly comprehend? Right now, I think it's just a cute metaphor, because we're too damn slow. Simply entering a Google query takes whole seconds. As long as the ubersphere includes us meat sacks, and as long as we are hamstrung by conventional interfaces, we're basically talking habit trail tubes and ping pong balls. We may be a mind hive, but the system is not clocking fast enough to cohere into a hive mind. That could change, though. In fact, it's pretty much bound to. And even now, before it does, we've got reason to worry. Our entire civilization is founded on something called economics. Now, economists flatter themselves by calling it the dismal science, but really it's only the dismal part that's accurate. It has very little connection to real science. Scientists discover the laws of nature. Economists invent the laws of economics. They build entire models in which oxygen is free and industrial waste disappears into the ether without any cost at all. Becoming an economist is a little like going to Klingon summer camp. You learn this wondrous language. It's elaborate and beautiful in a Rube Goldberg kind of way. It's even internally consistent. But back in the real world, there's still no such thing as Klingon. And sooner or later, the laws of physics are going to beat the crap out of you and steal your lunch money. Now, perhaps the most arbitrary piece of the economy is this thing called the stock market, in which, if I understand it correctly, the value of a physical item can fluctuate radically and rapidly for no good reason. The same number of people are using substance X at 11 a.m. as they were at 10. Nobody has shot half the global supply of X into the sun in the meantime. But in the space of a few clock cycles, X might lose half its value on the strength of a rumor. Now, that would violate all kinds of physical laws if this were science, but hey, it's only the foundation of modern civilization. No doubt any real economist would insist that I am grievously misrepresenting the field. But I do have a good friend who's a former investment banker. He retired in his 30s, and even his bitter ex-wife doesn't have to work another day in her life if she doesn't want to, so the dude obviously knows his Klingon. And he pretty much shares my view of the whole institution. These days he sends me a lot of Rolling Stones articles by Matt Taibbi, and he works on various environmental causes in kind of a quest for personal redemption. Anyway, he introduced me to these stock market algorithms that have been loose on the net for a number of years now. They're basically autonomous combat programs designed to carry out lightning-fast financial transactions so fast that a lag of microseconds routinely makes the difference between profit and bankruptcy. And this guy here is Kevin Slavin. I'm stealing the next couple of slides from stuff he presented at the TED Talk in July of last year because it is awesome. And he sums it up in a single quote. It takes you 500,000 microseconds just to click a mouse. But if you're a Wall Street algorithm and you're 5 microseconds behind, you're a loser. So to keep system latency down, there's that word again. We are literally blowing up hills between Chicago and New York. We are literally reshaping the physical landscape so that we can shorten the fiber optic cables between servers by a little bit and save a few microseconds so that our algos can win over their algos. The problem is, nobody really knows whose algos are who anymore, much less what they're doing. You see them running around in the wild, and traders have turned into a bunch of digital bird watchers, always alert for this signature wing flash or that mating call to put on their life list. Oh look, there's Twilight again. These algorithms are named for their apparent profiles, like Chinese viruses. Nobody really knows much about their behavior or their breeding habits, just that they're stock trading bots and that they, control the economy. As of last February, over 70% of stock trading was being done by robots. Now, these things are just programs. They do what they're told. At the same time, I'm pretty sure we didn't tell them to do this, which is what they did on May 6th of 2010. The Dow went off a cliff in a matter of seconds because a bunch of bots got into a feedback war. 9% of the stock market just vanished. And to this day, nobody really knows what happened, although more than a few papers have been written on the subject. And this was not an isolated incident. We have come to the brink a few times since. Apparently these kind of flash crashes are especially troublesome in India for some reason. I look at this a bit like an epileptic seizure. The signals bouncing back and forth between bots/hemispheres, reinforcing each other, spazzing out and revving ever faster until someone splits the corpus callosum to break the loop. That's the only reason the entire market didn't crash here, by the way. Somebody panicked and hit a big red button and just shut everything down for 5 seconds until those interacting algorithms fell out of sync. As a science fiction writer, I look at these words, latency, synchronous firing, neural networks, and I gotta ask, hey, did a part of the internet just wake up then? Was that an epileptic seizure or the dawning of a new consciousness? Of course, it was probably just an epileptic seizure. And even if it was the dawning of a new consciousness, it got killed at birth. But that was back in 2010. These things have only gotten smarter since then. They read newspapers looking for keywords and phrases to inform their trading decisions. They read your Facebook and Twitter posts. They even seed fake Twitter posts to try and psych out the competition. In a classic reboot of that story about the lady who swallowed the fly and then had no choice but to swallow an ever-expanding sequence of predators, there are now computer programs whose sole purpose is to write and disseminate their own financial stories, right down to graphics and headlines and tweets, designed solely to psych out other algos. This is not a Terminator movie. There's no revolution here. These things are just following instructions. But we've taught them to learn. We've taught them narrative structure and the rudiments of psychology. They're not just looking for keywords anymore, they're looking for context. They're analyzing not just the numbers in a story, but whether the story is upbeat or sad in tone. And they're constantly interacting with a whole menagerie of other agents with comparable capabilities, all trying to do what they've been told. This is the classic breeding ground for unpredictable emergent behavior. Now keep in mind, I'm not talking about the future or even the present. I'm talking about the recent past. These algos are still taking a lot of their leads from human sources, headlines and social media posts that have to be typed in on the keyboard at glacial speeds. Human latency is still the bottleneck. But it won't be for long. Look at what the future promises. Neural implants, augments, light speed interfaces. This stuff is coming, there's no doubt of it. These are some of the companies that have already commercialized brain-computer interfaces for everything from neuroprosthesis to gaming. Neurosilicon interfaces are already old news. We've had them for well over a decade now. We've got neuron cultures in petri dishes running flight simulators and robots and power grids. There's a machine in a Berkeley lab that can read the voxels off your visual cortex and figure out what your eyes are looking at faster than your conscious self can. A couple of years back, the guy who built it said we'd be able to read people's dreams in real time a few decades down the road. But just last week there was a story in the news about research that's already starting to do that. Sony has filed at least 2 patents for bypassing your sense organs entirely and planting sensory input directly into the brain. One uses compressed ultrasound, the other uses radio waves to stimulate targeted neurons from a distance. You don't even need a surgical implant. And this is only a glimpse of the stuff we are allowed to see at street level. The actual state of the art is squirreled away in DARPA labs somewhere, and at a guess, it's at least 10 years further advanced. 5 years ago, they admitted to a pair of high-tech binoculars that could read neural signatures for threats and targets right off the lower visual centers, long before the wearer became consciously aware of the threat. They likened it to a kind of spidey sense that would amp up threat response reflexes. This isn't just mind-reading technology. In a very real sense, it's mind-predicting technology. And it was 10 years behind the curve 5 years ago. We are the fleshy side of this weird grafted hybrid of meat and machinery. So far, its performance is bottlenecked by the hunt and peck speed of our manual interfaces, and it can still bring the world economy to the brink of collapse in a matter of seconds. Just a few million lines of code and some blowed-up mountains. What happens when we achieve Cory Doctorow's techno-utopian dream of being neuro-interfaced with the web 24/7? What happens when a few million human brains are integrated directly into the system? The idea of linking a whole bunch of brains together has a certain appeal. Faster interfaces, more tightly linked minds could be a great thing. Split brain patients outperform normal folks on visual search and pattern recognition, for example. 2 minds are better than 1 even when they're in the same head. And I see no reason why that advantage wouldn't scale up with a multiplicity of perspectives. So if the future of the internet consists of a myriad minds in high-speed contact with each other, I say yay, bring it on. But I'm not sure that's going to happen. I'm not even sure that it's possible. I don't necessarily buy into the hokey old trope of a conscious internet. But one thing nobody here doubts is that we are conscious. And when our exocrania wire us all together, I think there may be consequences we haven't thought about all that much. Because it won't be the way science fiction portrays these things. The Borg aren't going to forcibly graft us onto some godless commie technology explicitly designed to destroy our individuality. The transhumanists aren't going to win the next election and legislate us into the post-human state. So there won't be any of that gut-level revulsion, that basic transformation equals suicide algebra that might scare us into hitting the brakes. All that's going to happen is that iTunes will offer a much faster interface for downloading songs. Netflix will change its name, maybe to Mindflix, and offer streaming video directly onto the sensory cortex. People will sign up in droves. Suddenly, the rate-limiting step won't be 60 words a minute anymore. It'll be the speed of a nerve impulse. Bandwidth will skyrocket. System latency will drop through the fucking floor. What does that mean to us as individuals? Well, ask 1/2 of the supersized brain in that Marvel supervillain we were talking about. Ask the poor bastard Ramachandran talked about, who lived in that single isolated hemisphere, who had a few hours of self-identity to crack jokes and hit on the nurses before the other half woke up. You can't ask him, because he doesn't exist anymore. Right now, he has as much standalone personality as your parietal lobe. Does a thought know to stop at the edge of one skull when the neurons continue through to the next? Does the thought know the difference between a corpus callosum and a neural interface? Is it going to know enough to stop at the edge of your brain when it's got a path into someone else's? Depends on the interface, I guess. I'm sure they'll put lots of filters in place. Nothing will go wrong. But while consciousness is mysterious, there's no reason to think that it's magical. There's no evidence of pixie dust that traps souls in meat, keeps them from going walkabout. And one of the things we do know about consciousness is that it spreads to fill the space available, like water flowing downhill into a depression. We know that smaller personalities disappear into larger ones, and all it takes is an open door. We are a race of isolated hemispheres. Throughout our history, we have communicated via dial-up through speech and writing and images on screens. The Ubersphere is about to replace our dial-up with broadband. The internet is the corpus callosum that will bring us all together. So what if we're not shooting for a hive mind? It just might happen anyway. And when you have been submerged into that pool, reduced from standalone individual down to neural subroutine, there won't be enough of you left to want to get out again.